Welcome to this week's edition of Near and Rupar, our live weekly video show on Substack. I'm David Near, publisher of The Down Ballot. My co-host, as always, Aaron Rupar, publisher of Public Notice. Aaron, we have so much news to talk about this week, and we headlined this week's episode with Zohran Mamdani's enormous win in New York City and, of course, Andrew Cuomo's massive loss. But we also just got a series of really horrible Supreme Court rulings this morning on a whole bunch of different fronts. So I don't know, where do you want to start? Bad news? Good news?
I think we should probably close with the good news, just
Yes,
to send
okay.
people into their weekends, not
call.
dreading life. I actually had a chat I needed to have with just kind of normal family stuff with my wife, and she was trying to talk with me right after this Trump event ended about an hour ago, where Trump, of course, took a victory lap over the Supreme Court rulings and got the date of the Civil War incorrect. And there are all sorts of which was more laughable than anything, but she noted to me, she was like, I think you need to have some brain space after watching that. So let's talk later. And that's, so rather than put our viewers into that space, let's maybe put them into that space now. And then we can send them
take them out of it later.
Yeah, take them out of it later. And, I guess I had kind of forgotten because it seemed like it had been a little while that these Fridays, where you get the dump of the Supreme Court rulings at the end of the term. We had this, I believe, last year because, David, maybe you remember this better than I do, but wasn't it the last day of the term last year where we got the immunity ruling? I remember that being kind of like a big bombshell right at the end, although I might be misremembering the exact sequence of that. But today kind of reminded me of that a little bit, this feeling that, due to the Supreme Court, our democracy is kind of slipping further and further away. And, the thing that I didn't, maybe you can kind of expound on this a little bit, because the thing I didn't realize until prepping, for this show, obviously I understood some of the import of this ruling about nationwide injunctions. And then, there's a separate question about birthright citizenship, which it sounds like the court might get to in their next term, which begins in the fall. But the thing I hadn't really fully processed is that, there's something like 28 states that did not challenge Trump's executive order on birthright citizenship. And now it sounds like there's a 30-day delay here before the ruling goes into effect. But then after that, there might be kind of this very chaotic time period where, red states that have not challenged Trump's executive order might no longer have birthright citizenship. So if you are, there's scenarios where someone could be born in the United States and not be a citizen, which is something we haven't experienced in the U.S. with very minor exceptions going back to, I think, 1868.
Everything is completely screwed up and extremely chaotic. I saw someone tweet, or I should say post on Blue Sky this morning, clearly the founders intended that there would be a Friday in June where we're all hitting refresh to see which of our rights have gotten taken away. I mean, This pattern of saving all of their most controversial, i.e. worst decisions for the very end of their term, is something that we've seen the Supreme Court do a long time. Laura Bellin, our guest last week, chimed in comments. Thank you, Laura, to say that, yes, it was the last day of the term last year when the Supreme Court issued that immunity ruling. In terms of the specifics, it's completely wild what they've done here. And you're exactly right that we now have two totally different regimes that are likely to emerge in the red states versus the blue states. So just to catch people up, Trump issued this executive order, which is absolute garbage, unconstitutional, and does not have the force of law, basically saying there's no such thing as birthright citizenship anymore. In other words, this idea that has been in place since the adoption of the 14th Amendment, that if you're born in the United States, that you're a citizen of the United States, no longer applies. In other words, he's purporting to repeal an amendment of the Constitution via a piece of paper that he, scrawled with a Sharpie. So what the Supreme Court did today, Aaron, you're astute to point this out. What they said is that a district court judge cannot create an injunction, cannot impose an injunction that applies nationwide against something like an executive order. It could be a nationwide injunction about anything, but in this case, it's an executive order. That's completely separate from the merits of the challenge to Trump's order. So, in other words, this injunction was just to prevent this executive order from having any legal force whatsoever while the merits of the case could be adjudicated. This is a very normal thing that happens in a lot of litigation. And so now the Supreme Court is saying, well, in these other states, these other areas, red states, where it has been no injunction yet. This order can potentially go into effect until we rule on it, like you said, Aaron, in the next term. And
Mhm.
that's absolute chaos. It's an absolute nightmare. It's an absolute mess. And aside from the racism of this all, aside from the unconstitutional effects of this all, there's simply the mess of it all. How do you administer this? What's going to happen to newborn babies born in some of these states? Are they going to be deported within an hour of birth? That's what the Supreme Court is opening the door to here. Meanwhile, a newborn baby in New York or Minnesota or California isn't going to face that same threat. So it's just absolute chaos. This is what they've created, and you have to believe this is what they want.
Yeah, I mean, there was some talk earlier this term of, in select rulings where, especially Amy Coney Barrett seemed to side with some of the liberals and Roberts as well, but I think, some of the rulings today kind of put to bed this notion that there's any significant resistance on the court to what Trump is trying to do. And it also, isn't there, the Constitution is very clear that, well, first of all, the 14th Amendment is very clear, which is kind of the underpinnings of this birthright citizenship case. But, and I saw even before, just before we logged on here, Jamie Raskin was on MSNBC basically saying, the Constitution is very clear. When they get around to the merits, they're going to lose on this. And I was kind of like, are we sure about that?
Yeah,
I still think there's kind of this assumption that there's a degree of good faith. They're kind of level setting on the court, and I think they've kind of forfeited that benefit of the doubt at this point because kind of even setting the law aside, which obviously you can't do in situations like this. But David, I think you're right to highlight, just how unworkable this system will end up being. And, I have seen some lawyers kind of expressing some hope that given this 30-day delay that, there'll be more organized legal challenges in some of these red states. But now, there's this additional complication of, the ruling today, there's no nationwide injunctions, but then it leaves the door open for like a class action or some sort of, broader group that brings a lawsuit. And what would that look like? There'd be separate relief for all these different entities across many different states. Would the court have to presumably take up each one of them individually? It just seems completely unworkable. I mean, do you have any insight into how that part of it works? So if you're a group in Texas right now and you want to bring, some sort of case to stop the end of birthright citizenship in 30 days, you have to find someone obviously with standing and things like that. But like, who would be part of that group? Is there anything in the ruling today that kind of outlines how that would work?
The possibility of a million different lawsuits applying strictly to a million different plaintiffs is a real possibility. There was already a civil rights organization in Maryland that immediately after the ruling today amended its complaint in a case challenging this executive order to try to certify a class for a class action. But at the same time, you got to remember that the Supreme Court and the conservatives throughout the federal judiciary have tried to make it so hard to ever certify a class. They want to try to make massive group litigation extremely difficult, and there's a lot of reasons for that. From administrability, this is a term that lawyers and judges like to talk about. From an administrability perspective, they have unleashed total chaos here, and it's impossible to know what's going to happen. There certainly will be additional suits. There will be attempts to certify classes. But you know what? There are going to be some lunatic Trump judges out there who are going to find in favor of the executive order. So we're going to have a total mishmash of rulings before this 30 days is up, after the 30 days is up as well, because again, it'll take time before the case can be heard on the merits. So the Supreme Court, conservatives love to talk a big game about, how important it is to have well-functioning courts and the caseloads of our courts. And, we see this with tort reform, trying to prevent people who get injured by big companies from suing, making it more difficult, making it harder for them to win big awards. And what it comes down to it, though, that's just a pretext. If they can use fears of court chaos to shut down normal people from vindicating their rights, they do. And then when they can prevent people from vindicating their rights by causing more court chaos, that's exactly what they do as well.
Yeah, and this is maybe a good opportunity to note for people tuning in, or if you have been tuned in, that David obviously is a lawyer. I am not, but I can do my
Ex-lawyer,
best to kind of.
ex-lawyer, as I always remind you, Aaron.
Well, yeah. I mean, at one time you were a lawyer and went through law
Yes.
school and all of that. So, obviously these are pretty complex topics. So, if there are viewers who have questions, we can do our best to address them. You do have to be
Absolutely.
a paid subscriber either to the down ballot or public notice. But if you do have any questions that you'd like for us to try to tackle, you can put them in the chat stream at the bottom. I'm keeping an eye on it. So, that could be one way to get your questions answered because, for a lot of people, including myself to this point, although maybe this weekend I will try to actually read the ruling. But the thing dropped, and then 30 minutes later, Trump was at the podium, expounding on this and kind of spinning it in a very political way. And I guess that kind of leads me to a question that I have for you, David, which is, Trump in taking this victory lap was saying that. Next, because of this ruling, is going to be kind of defunding trans medical care. He talked about deportation. That this kind of affirms a lot of what he wants to do in terms of mass deportation as well. So we've been talking about birthright citizenship specifically, but are there other areas
Yeah.
of policy where the fact that nationwide injunctions are dead now could where that could play a role?
Everything. Everything that was previously subject to one of these injunctions now won't be. And so it will require people to file a million more lawsuits, like we were just saying. So, you know what? I can't believe I'm saying this, but Trump is right. This is a huge win for him, legally
Mhm.
speaking. And God, there was this line in Amy Coney Barrett's opinion, which is just so disgusting and appalling and gets to exactly your question, Aaron, where she said, and I don't have it right in front of me, so I'm not going to quote it exactly, but the gist of it was, of course, everyone expects the executive to respect the rule of law. Well, okay. But at the same time, she also said, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the courts are capable of enforcing it. So then what does that mean? That is the emptiest bullshit possible and
Yeah.
opens the door to outright fascism. Because if all that is necessary for the Supreme Court is just to nod and say, "Oh yeah, we expect them to comply," what happens if they don't? Then that means that it doesn't matter if they don't. That means you're saying, "Well, it would be nice if they complied," and it's the court completely emasculating itself in the service of autocracy. And so we are going to see Trump run wild with many of these illegal decisions and orders that he is issuing because the courts are so much less empowered to stop him. Now, what will happen is that eventually, once there is time for full briefing and testimony and for judges to write complete opinions and for those to go up on appeal and probably eventually be heard by the Supreme Court, once that whole process plays out, then Trump is going to still lose on a lot of these cases. Not all of them, though,
Mhm.
because we've seen what the Supreme Court's willing to do, but we know he'll
Yeah.
lose on a lot of them because these very conservative Trump judges in a lot of cases have been ruling against him. But it's what happens in the meantime. It's why injunctions exist in the first place, is to preserve the status quo until a case can be heard. And so a lot of people are going to get hurt. And then eventually what will happen is, yeah, a lot of these rules will be struck down. But in the meantime, people are going to get screwed and people are going to get deported, for instance, or denied care.
Yeah. And, people might remember that nationwide injunctions were also kind of a bugaboo cutting the other way for Biden with some of the, furthest right judges. And so that was kind of the cynicism of some of the spin today was breathtaking, where you had Pam Bondi basically up there at the podium saying, well, this has been a problem going back 5 administrations. It's a bipartisan issue. And so this is really a win for the whole country when, these always kind of cut against Democrats somehow, it seems like. Or at least, when Trump is in office, some of these injunctions are just trying to kind of maintain the structure of our democracy and the rule of law. When Biden was in office, it was very clearly to stymie policies that he wanted enacted. And so I don't think those things are quite the same, but, it reminded me a little bit of when James Comey was fired and Trump cited the fact that he had been too mean to Hillary Clinton as a reason for doing
Right,
that, where it's
right,
like,
right.
yeah, it's just very cynical. And yeah, I actually, coming out of the New York City news earlier this week, it was kind of heading into the weekend, not exactly feeling good, but feeling some pangs of hope. And then, we had this Friday, I don't know if it was necessarily a news dump, but a ruling dump that kind of quashed that pretty quick.
Yeah, so in particular, there's that judge in Texas Matthew Kacsmaryk, who's the craziest judge in America, or at least one of the competitors for that title. And he issued a lot of those nationwide injunctions barring Biden from doing various things. And yeah, one of the few silver linings, if you can even call it that, for democracy here is that now, those injunctions can go and be attacked and they should be thrown out. Though I wouldn't put it past the Supreme Court to find some kind of carve out for, why certain nationwide injunctions might actually be okay in the end. But, it's to that point about nationwide injunctions allegedly being a problem all this time that's finally been cleared up by the Supreme Court. They're doing that for this guy. I mean, why didn't
Right.
they say this? Why didn't they say this when Biden was president? Right?
Yeah.
It's so naked, it's so obvious, and it's so transparent that they want to end this practice for the most corrupt president in American history.
Yeah, I mean that really is the shocking thing. I mean, there is also kind of the reality that the two Trumpiest justices were not the ones that not among the three that Trump put on the court, which is kind of interesting. But I think it's hard to say. It's hard to get into their minds because as I kind of mentioned earlier, there was a little bit of chatter that oh man, Amy Coney Barrett has an independent streak and she hasn't really been as Trumpy as people maybe thought, other than Dobbs, of course. But now it's kind of back to full blown Trumpism, especially this term. And so, yeah, it's hard to count. Is it just kind of the worries that they don't want to be targets of kind of the right wing vitriol, or just the subject of Trump's kind of mean posts or something like that? Trump, who I don't think he ever went as far as to say anything bad about Amy Coney Barrett, but today he completely, was embracing her and saying, "Oh, I think she's great. I've always respected her." Because I believe a reporter even asked him specifically, that, about some of the commentary from his supporters criticizing her. And, he basically dismissed that, said, I hadn't really paid any attention to that, but, I have total respect for her and I think she's doing a great job. So, it's all kumbaya and
Yeah.
harmony over in Megaland right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is both.
Yeah.
These people on the Supreme Court, especially these, not just the Trump appointees, but also Alito and Thomas in particular, like you were emphasizing, they are in some cases true believers, like Alito and Thomas. In other cases, maybe true believers, but also just disgusting cynics, like John Roberts. And then there is also the MAGA threat of violence. And that's why they engage in these kinds of threats. That's why Trump promotes stochastic terrorism. Stochastic terrorism is this idea that, you're not running a cell of Al Qaeda, but you're pushing people out there and suggesting, oh, maybe, violent attacks or extra legal actions might be a good idea. Who knows? And then someone inevitably takes you up on it. The Tree of Life synagogue shooter in Pittsburgh is a really perfect, scary example of that. So I think it's all of the above. This is the
Yeah.
America they want, and they're probably also afraid. And maybe they think that by doing this stuff, they will get some of these threats off their back. But they've created this America where
Yeah.
this kind of violent threat is possible and has now become part of our political system, which is, I can't believe I just uttered those words. It's just so horrifying to contemplate. I really think it's all of the above.
What's your sense of the rulings like this and the role that they could play in making the Supreme Court an issue heading into the midterms? There was a lot of talk coming out of Dobbs for a moment there about maybe expanding the Supreme Court or different things that Democrats could do if they had a trifecta. Which seems the notion of a Democratic trifecta these days is very kind of fanciful given the Senate map, not only next year, but, in upcoming cycles as well. But, I mean, I think the natural, and you probably get this too from your readers, where I very much in my newsletter this week kind of been, unfortunately, in kind of a doom spiral in the sense that like there's a lot of bad news out there right now. And so, yeah, I don't want to be constantly bumming people out, but people naturally want to know what they can do, how we can fix this with the court. They're very, which is kind of the whole problem. They're pretty much unaccountable. So there's very little that can be done, with the exception of, if Democrats had basically total power, you could maybe expand the court. You could, in theory, I guess, impeach justices. That's not going to happen. But
No.
I mean, just what's your sense as you're immersed in kind of down ballot, what candidates for, state level offices and federal offices in states that, running for Senate, how do you think this plays out over the next year? Is it just kind of another thing to sort of add to the, sort of the frustration that people have about the current state of things?
Now, it's a little early to say what the defining issues of 2026 will be, but I
Yeah.
think it will broadly be Trump. Trump and the GOP and the GOP enabling Trump and GOP corruption and also just the destructive cuts to so many aspects of the federal government and the undermining of the American way of life. I I always want to caution people away from thinking that there is a magic wand we might wave to undo all of this. There just isn't. And even if Democrats in 2028 were to control the House, or after 2028, the House, the Senate, and the White House, I think that serious Supreme Court reform would still be a heavy lift. And an indictment of the Democratic Party, frankly. But I don't want to depress people because what we are seeing right now is, despite the fecklessness of so many Democratic leaders, we are seeing massive enthusiasm at the ballot box, especially in special elections, which I talk about all the time, for Democratic candidates. And in particular, and this might be a good segue, Aaron, to talk about what just went down in New York City, though we could put a pin in that if you want. And in particular, we are seeing incredible enthusiasm for Democratic candidates who want to do things a different way. And obviously in New York City, Zohran Mamdani, he's running for mayor. He's not running for federal office, but there's no question that he is saying the old ways don't work. And we have to focus on new ways. And I think you're going to see a lot of candidates take to heart his primary victory. And there are going to be some people who are definitely were planning to go in there saying, got to burn it down. And there are going to be other people who are, a little less sure and maybe move toward more of a reformist message going into 2026. That's the number one takeaway I would have from that election. People are thirsting, dying for something new. And Democrats who don't pay attention to that, they're going to lose a lot of primaries.
Yeah, and David, you probably, I mean, obviously you live in New York, so you probably were more immersed in the mayoral campaign than I was. I mean, I was kind of following it from afar. And then this week, my interest obviously peaked with
Oh,
Mamdani's victory, which, he was on MSNBC a couple nights ago. He's on CNN last night. Like, he's really becoming kind of this national figure. And, the sense that I got just kind of reading some of the commentary analysis of the campaign was that, he was really relentlessly focused on cost of living, the cost for small business owners, kind of making the city more affordable. I saw some people pointing out that, which, I did enough research to check out his website, that, was very focused on cost of living issues kind of across the board. And, I couldn't help but notice then this morning, Alyssa Slotkin was on MSNBC, and she had been talking about this in fairness before Mamdani's victory, but, she was very focused on, the cost of living, people's frustration about that being like a very powerful issue for Democrats to kind of lock in. And now, there's kind of the other part of my brain that's like, man, we're amid like this authoritarian takeover of the country. And Mamdani, I don't think, shied away from that. I know he called Trump a fascist and talked a lot about Trump too, so it's not like he was ignoring that. But, I wonder what you think about that as kind of like a takeaway for Dems from the New York campaign, that, maybe kind of really honing in on an issue or two that's salient to people, maybe a pocketbook issue, since that kind of cuts across. Everybody experiences inflation when it happens, or if costs go up, that kind of makes everybody mad. What do you think about the potency of that as a takeaway and kind of a lane of messaging that could be effective for Democrats?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question. Mamdani was so singularly focused on affordability. And I think affordability is a great way to frame it. And Aaron, I think you make such an interesting point that Alyssa Slotkin, who won a very difficult race for Michigan Senate last year, but is also very prone to wanting to punch left, also wants to focus on affordability. And so for all of the hysteria over Mamdani being so far to the left and a democratic socialist, et cetera, the issue he's focusing on is exactly the same thing that one of the most moderate, vocally moderate members of the Democratic Senate caucus also wants to focus on. So this can be and should be a unifying issue for the entire party. Now, to your point, Aaron, about, rising autocracy and the erosion and destruction of democracy, I think that Democrats can talk about both things, but uh, you know, if you can get people out to vote by talking about affordability, and they wind up voting for Democrats as a result, then that accomplishes your goal if you want to preserve democracy, because there's only one party that believes in democracy anymore in the United States. So it doesn't matter why someone shows up to vote for you as long as they vote for you. And so if the affordability message is more effective than a democracy related message, absolutely go for it. It's like, like you said, even Zohran Mamdani is running for mayor. Even he's aware of it. And Alyssa Slotkin, she might talk about how affordability is the existential crisis to the United States, but she also knows that Trump is an existential crisis to the United States. And much of the Democratic Party does get that. They just have to be forced to understand it better. So again, as long as Democrats win, it doesn't matter really how they win. It matters that they win.
Yeah. And there's a comment here from Marlis who notes that New York City is not rural America. But David, I think what you were just saying kind of applies to that because yes,
Oh yeah.
and this was kind of part of my reaction too. I mean, I'm sure you saw some Blue Sky where it was like on Wednesday, some of the takes, in terms of like this being kind of a new path for Democrats seemed a little kind of overcooked to me or like, kind of inferring too much from this. However, like we were just talking about with cost of living, cost for small business owners, like this is an issue that, whether you're in New York City or in rural America,
Yeah.
obviously the last election cycle inflation was such a damaging issue for Biden. And that wasn't just, I'm sure
Yeah.
if you were very affluent, maybe you're a little more insulated from that, obviously. But, for the vast majority of voters, that's going to be something that affects you no matter what. So, maybe that is kind of, finding these issues that aren't kind of the wedge issues, like a lot of the cultural issues that, maybe people living in big cities are really invested in. But if you're living in, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Minnesota, places like that, maybe they're not quite as salient. Depending on where you're living and kind of, who you are as a person. But, maybe focusing on costs is, especially as Trump is imposing tariffs that the party broadly supports behind him. It's like that's just him. I don't think a lot of Republicans are true believers in that, but they have to express support to kind of stay in good standing. So, maybe that is kind of an idea of something that, goes beyond New York City, which obviously has kind of a
Oh
unique,
yeah.
It's more progressive, obviously, than your average voting demographic in the United States. But, Mamdani seemed pretty good at kind of, avoiding some of the landmines that have tripped up other Dems and really staying laser focused on issues that, are of interest to everybody.
Yeah, and Mamdani did not throw anyone under the bus. You have all these
Mhm.
centrist pundits and some Democrats who, in particular, want Democrats to throw trans people under the bus. And Mamdani didn't do that. And I think the way he stayed true to his values, no question about that. But when you focus on a broad issue that really, like you said, Aaron, affects everyone, whether you live in the suburbs or a place like New York City or a rural area, when you focus on a broad issue like affordability, people know and hear that you care about them. And Josh Marshall of Talking Points Memo, he put it well in an essay a little while back that Donald Trump's attacks on Kamala Harris about trans rights, to the extent they were effective, it was not so much about convincing voters that Kamala Harris is solely obsessed with trans people, but rather Kamala Harris is obsessed with certain social issues and doesn't care about you. And that's
Yeah.
what that means. And Zohran Mamdani very clearly cares about you. And that's why, he was able to avoid those pitfalls you were saying in terms of, his, vigorous support for people's rights. And, also, yeah, obviously every part of the country is different. But if Slotkin, who credits her win to focusing on these kinds of issues of cost of living, of affordability, can win in Michigan, and Mamdani can win a Democratic primary in New York City, focusing on these same sets of issues, then yeah, it does seem like a powerhouse move for Democrats to make this a centerpiece.
Yeah, the other thing I'll note, which is a little bit of a non sequitur, is just how amazing Mamdani's videos were. I
Oh
saw
yeah.
some people kind of weighing in. Were like, he always sort of had his head tilted, which is, I guess, that kind of signifies like interest.
Oh,
And then,
like
the way that they were,
like that.
they're very much filmed almost like a I don't know, sitcom, kind of a sitcom-ish, right? Where they're little kind of skits. He's in, he's in a bodega and he's eating and then he's chewing, but it's kind of, he's talking while he's chewing. But they were very much, they're entertaining. Again, me as someone who didn't really have a dog in that fight, so to speak. Just watching his videos, I mean, I found them to be very captivating and they're really easy to watch in a way that, we think of typical political commercials, like they're kind of background noise, or, especially when they're Trump ones, they're almost kind of like, annoying or sort of like agitating in a way, some of the transphobic ones and whatnot. But his videos were like so well done and kind of a very, way that kind of went beyond what you'd think of as a typical political ad and was almost like the type of production value you'd see on like a successful TV show or something. So I don't know to what extent, certainly Cuomo was very much more, had a lot more funding. I'm sure he was blanketing the airwaves in a way that Mamdani was not able to do. But the quality of his videos, I thought, really jumped out, as someone who was kind of immersed endorsing that stuff all the time.
I think that that is such an interesting point, precisely because you must watch more video than probably any American. I think you definitely exceed the FDA recommended daily allowance.
Yes.
Um,
For
but
political video, yeah.
for political video,
Yeah.
certainly. But you what you get at, Aaron, is something that I think was really important to Mamdani's campaign, which was that he was so positive and filled with joy, and he ran with a smile. And Cuomo ran with a scowl. Now, that is not it's not sufficient to win. That alone is not going to do it. But I think that draws people in, especially new people. And Mamdani unquestionably was able to bring in a lot of new, younger voters for this kind of amazing multi-ethnic coalition that he put together. I was watching a video that cracked me up, Aaron, this morning. They did a Zohran Mamdani lookalike contest, and they had all these dudes dressed in suits in Prospect Park, I think it was.
Oh.
And they crowned a winner. They did it by ranked choice voting. It was totally hilarious.
Oh, wow.
And then I got to thinking, what would an Andrew Cuomo lookalike contest be like?
His brother would be on there, Chris.
Yeah, God, yeah.
Well, that leads me, because I did want to ask, before we run out of time here, because this was part of some of the commentary I saw on Blue Sky was that, Mamdani was a great victory for him, but it was also kind of like a discrediting of the Democratic establishment with Cuomo losing.
Yeah.
And I wonder to what extent, because I think of Cuomo as being, kind of having unique baggage, just given his background, in a way that, I wouldn't want to saddle with like your typical normie Democrat. Of course, Bill Clinton jumped in at the end to endorse him, and that's looking pretty bad. And a lot of even politicians who didn't really necessarily endorse him, have kind of avoided endorsing Mamdani even after his victory earlier this week. But again, New York has kind of weird politics to me as an outsider. I kind of wonder how, even like Eric Adams, it's like, how did this guy get elected as mayor? It was notable this week. I posted this that on Wednesday morning, he was on Fox and Friends. Then he was on Newsmax that day. Then he was on Fox Business the next day. So that to me kind of suggests that he's already sort of planning for his next possible, like a media commentator gig, after being mayor. Because I wouldn't think that a lot of New Yorkers are watching Newsmax. Could be wrong on that. But I guess I'm just kind of curious your thoughts in the implications beyond Mamdani, but like what that says about kind of the Democratic brand more broadly, given that, Cuomo seemed to have some support among like the biggest names of the party and, really crashed out kind of spectacularly.
You're right that Cuomo has, I don't want to say uniquely terrible baggage, but he's pretty high up there.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just the baggage that sank him, because he ran the oldest of old school campaigns. Politico had a really good piece today on just how out of step his campaign was. He expected to be crowned the winner. He showed up as the front runner with huge leads in the polls. He never really wanted to run for mayor in the first place anyway. He was purely viewing this as a stepping stone back into public life, maybe even to a White House run. That's how delusional he still is. And the the opening of this Politico piece talked about how Cuomo's launch video was 17 minutes long. I mean, I couldn't believe my eyes. 17 minutes. I mean, I've watched plenty of candidate launch videos. I'm sure you probably have as well. They're usually 2-3 minutes at the most. I mean, that's just so insane. And there was another great detail, Aaron, that Cuomo's team, Cuomo hadn't ever really lived in New York City. He'd been living in Westchester until, just a few months before launching his campaign. Cuomo's team did not understand basic things like how to get around the city. And so they would plan these back-to-back events that were like, let's say, 2 or 3 miles apart from one another. But in New York City, driving 3 miles takes a million years. And they didn't realize that because they're used to suburban distances. And of course, Cuomo ain't taking the subway. And so it's just emblematic of just how old school his campaign was. And, relying on all this dark money, these outside ads, running with a scowl on his face is how Politico put it. That style of campaigning, that is very endemic to a lot of Democratic incumbents. And so in that sense, I really do think Mamdani's win was a huge rejection of a particular view of politics that is just so discredited at this point.
And so how do you now handicap the general and get me up to speed, get me up to speed on this, because I'm not sure I've seen the decisive confirmation that Cuomo is running. Maybe I've missed that. I saw that he was considering
I'll lay it all out.
Okay, go for it.
I'll lay it all out.
Okay.
So before the primary, Cuomo got a independent ballot line. You can do this in New York City. You can create your own party. I forget even what it's called, but basically he assured himself a spot on the general election as an independent. Now, Eric Adams did the exact same thing because he left the Democratic Party specifically to become an independent. He didn't even run in the Democratic primary. Then there's a Republican candidate, total weirdo and gadfly who ran last time, got 28% of the vote, named Curtis Sliwa. And then there's yet another independent, some attorney whose name I just can't remember, not anyone well known. Now, the question is Cuomo going to continue on and run a real campaign in the general election? He obviously created this second ballot line for himself to keep open that possibility. But I think that he did that for a scenario, for instance, let's say he had won in the first choice votes and then very narrowly lost the ranked choice tabulations. Those haven't happened yet, by the way. Yeah. They're not going to happen until next week. So, maybe he beats Mamdani in the first round and then loses 52-48 after all the ranked choice tabulations are done. And he's like, well, this gives me reason to go on. But the fact that he got his ass kicked in the first round really just takes away that kind of rationale. So he has not said whether or not he'll continue on. Now, what we do know is that he will appear on the ballot because today was the deadline to take your name off. And from everything we can tell, Cuomo did not do that or is not doing that. So his name will appear on the ballot, but he might not lift a finger. The question now is, what will these Wall Street finance titans do? Because they, of course, have been freaking out. They've been acting like it's the end of the world, and they are threatening to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to nuke Mamdani in the general election. Well, if Cuomo is on the ballot in name only and doesn't want to run, they can't go with him. Sliwa, the Republican, is just a total clown. They're supposedly trying to get him off the ballot, too. He said the only way I'll be off the ballot is if I'm in a pine box 6 feet under. And so that really leaves them Eric Adams, who, he's charismatic to a certain extent and still has some residual support with maybe a few corners of the city, but he's a messy dude. And, the corruption allegations haven't gone away just because Trump dropped the indictment. I think they're going to try because they are just so terrified of Mamdani because they're a bunch of babies. But Mamdani is still the favorite.
Yeah, and Sliwa, I'm probably more familiar with him than most because he's a regular guest on Laura Ingram's show. And he's one of those guys now who has kind of renewed relevance. He's been on there kind of daily almost at this point. So I can understand why he wants to run because, he can parlay that into more attention, maybe get like a contributor gig or something like that. But yeah, I mean, you're right that there doesn't seem to really be much of an alternative, which is great for Mamdani. And, maybe if he does a good job as mayor, that could be kind of a helpful contribution in terms of like defanging some of the hysteria of the right. Trump today was saying, this communist in New York won, this is so bad for New York City, but, the rest of the country rejects it. But, if things kind of are normal, which I assume they will be, I don't think there's going to be full communism in New York and the businesses aren't going to be shut down and Wall Street will continue, that maybe that can be one way to kind of, normalize being, a little left of center and, kind of these Red Scare tactics of, socialism, he's a communist, maybe it can defang some of that, hopefully.
I think you're exactly right. The fact is, New York is such a massive city with such a huge bureaucracy that no matter what Mamdani's more unconventional ideas are, 95%, if not more, of what he would have to do if he is elected mayor is just the normal functioning of New York City and making sure that things are running well with the fire department and the police department and the schools and the subways and the streets are getting cleaned. Like if he's able to open a handful of city-run grocery stores, I think it's a fascinating idea.
Yeah, sure.
But most of the vast majority of his time would be occupied with the normal tasks of governance. Aaron, I wish I could remember who said this because I'd love to credit them. But on the one hand, there are all these Republicans who are saying, oh, they can't wait to tie Democrats to Mamdani and he's going to, sink the party like a stone and be an anvil around their necks. And on the other hand, you have these schmucks like Bill Ackman, the zillionaire, who's threatening to, nuke Mamdani from orbit by spending, hundreds of millions of dollars against him. Well, which is it? If Mamdani is such political kryptonite for Democrats, shouldn't they want him to win?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
but obviously, I think that they don't really believe that. And of course, the amazing thing is that guys like Ackman want to spend all this money to try to stop Mamdani, but the idea that you should raise their taxes even one penny sends them into hysterics. So, these guys are incoherent.
Yeah, I mean, Ackman himself would actually be someone I could see running, in a different universe. Is he actually New York City resident? I guess I don't know that part of it,
That's a
but
good question.
he,
Who
yeah,
knows?
he's on CNBC quite a bit, and he's in studio in New York, so I assume he's kind of around there, if he's not living in the city. The other thing I want to ask you before we sign off here that I just learned today, is that of course there's ranked choice voting,
Right.
in the primary, but then there isn't
Not.
for the
Yeah.
general. So that's kind of odd. Like in Minneapolis, they have ranked choice all the way down, for the general as well. What's the reason for that? Because and then what's the reason for number one and number two? I would think that at this stage that's actually really helpful for Mamdani because he cross endorsed with is it Lander
Right.
the
Right.
attorney
Right.
there, and so Lander came in third. So if you just kind of do the math on that, if you put their support together, that becomes pretty formidable. I think that it'd be probably in the 40% rate there. But so anyway, why not have it in the general? And then it seems like that bodes well for Mamdani at this point too.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So, ranked choice voting is very new to New York City. I mean, it's new pretty much anywhere. And it was only implemented for the first time in 2021. And the answer is there is no good reason.
Hmm.
There was the city charter had to be revised. It's like, the constitution for the city. The city charter had to be revised to allow ranked choice voting. And for whatever reason, the Charter Reform Commission chose to only change primaries. Like it's not like a place where citizens can put a ballot measure on the ballot themselves. Only the city government can. So it's really not clear to me why they made that choice. It's kind of a weird one. I tend to think that you're right that a split field might help Mamdani. On the other hand, like I say, he's still the favorite. I think he's still looking strong. And the more the attacks ramp up against him and the more hysterical they become, I kind of think that a lot of people will cotton to him, not least because he has the D after his name on the
Yeah.
ballot. And I mean, they're talking about deporting him. I mean, are you fucking kidding me?
Yeah, Andy Hochul's. Yeah, yeah.
So I think he'd be the favorite either way. This is still a very democratic town. And yeah, but there's no good answer on the ranked choice voting. Maybe it'll change in the future, but for now, it's plurality wins. He only needs to get more votes, one more vote than whoever the next guy is.
Yeah. Well, I need to log off because at the top of the hour, Trump has another on-camera event.
Oh,
So
great.
it's one of those exhausting days. But we should also note for viewers that we will not be on next week because it's the 4th of July, but we'll return the week following on the 11th. And so thank you to the roughly 900 people who tuned in today. We will also, of course, put this on both of our sites. And, if you have not yet subscribed to the Down Ballot, which is David's publication, which absolutely tremendous must-read coverage of all the down ballot races. And if we really ran out of stuff today, I was going to ask you some Scott Brown questions. Since I know you've written about him a little, like he's one of those recurring characters where I can't believe he's running again.
Right?
Although I guess when he first won the Senate, back in 2010, he must have been pretty young because he still presents as a younger guy despite having been around now for at least 15 years or so. But definitely subscribe to the Down Ballot if you haven't already. My publication, Public Notice. If you already enjoyed the Down Ballot but haven't checked out my publication, please check it out at publicnotice.co. And David, any closing remarks on your end?
I saw there was a question. When is the New York City mayoral election? This November, the same time as all the other big elections, New Jersey, Virginia, Pennsylvania, one of those just off year elections. Everyone, have a fantastic 4th of July weekend next weekend, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
See you in a couple of weeks.